Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Today's lecture in Fundamental Principles in Bioethics, and today's lecture is on adaptiveness and selection. I'm going to do adaptiveness first, and then the second part will be on selection. Okay, so the chapters, I'll do chapter 7 first, and then 6. So we begin as always in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings, for the gift of life, and for having us here today. We ask that you send your Holy Spirit to illumine our hearts and minds, always to discern your will in our lives, and to live according to your divine will. We ask your inspiration as we seek to understand more deeply nature, the nature that surrounds us, and our own human nature, being created in your image and likeness, and also according to the natural process of evolution that applies to every living species on Earth. As always, we pray for those who are in most need of your divine mercy, in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Okay, first, any questions or comments or anything from previous lectures or the course, the program? Yes, Luis?
I was reading in the LA Times this past week that they have developed a process where I guess they used to cut and paste.
Yes.
To change in the DNA.
Yes.
But they found a way now to not cut and paste, but to actually just erase it, just like with a pencil, with the eraser. And so they can, but the only thing that I believe they can change is they can change the C to a T, which is a really drastic change because the C usually lines up with G, right?
Right.
And then the T lines up with A.
Correct.
So they're saying that
T.
this process will be able to cure like 14% of a lot of genetic diseases.
Yes, so that is gene editing.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about that. We're going to pick it up more in next class, next semester, and then also in the summer when we talk about environmental bioethics, but essentially modifying the genetic code, right? And then the big bioethical question there is who has the right to modify the human genetic code, because that is the patrimony of humanity. It belongs to all of us, really.
Yeah.
So how do we make those decisions? We assume that it's good when we're trying to get rid of genetic defects, for example, okay? But we have to realize that those changes are there for life, for the history of humanity going forward, and we don't know really what secondary effects may be from making those changes. So that's a big unknown bioethically, how to decide on how to change. And then that's at the level of principle, if you will, but also at the level of practice, how to do it with what? Because typically they experiment on the human embryo, and that has big bioethical issues for us, because those embryos are being manipulated and then they're being destroyed. So it's at two levels. It's at the level of principle of whether we should alter the human genome or not, and then at the level of practice, how to do it. If we agree to do it, let's say for the good, then how to do it. The process also needs to be justified ethically, right? So we'll get to all those issues, but it's happening. It's happening now in our contemporary history. Stuff that was science fiction a few years ago is happening now. Okay, let's move forward. I want to talk about adaptiveness now. And as I said, finish with natural selection because we left it pending. We looked at the four main forces of evolution, the four main forces. Again, we can summarize them in a single word, a symbolic word for each one of them, which are what? They don't have to be necessarily in a particular order. But if we start, let's say, at the genetic level, at the level of DNA, what do we have? Mutations, right? And then at the level of the phenotype of the expression, migration of populations, migrations in and out of areas, right? Also known as gene what?
Flow.
Gene flow. In other words, the genetic material, if you think about it, is we are a DNA molecule in a population of zebra. Wherever the zebra goes, the DNA of that zebra goes, right? So gene flow, the genes are flowing from one geographic area to another with all the implications that that has. And then we introduce the element of chance, random chance, which is known also in genetic terms is known as what? Genetic what? Genetic drift. Drift. Okay. No one sample of a population contains all of the genes of that population, all the variation. Remember quantitative traits, remember variation, right? And then finally, selection, which is the actual mechanism of evolution itself that may cause evolution. So with regards to adaptiveness, what we see when we just start with the simple observation, looking out the window into nature. When we look at nature, the nature that surrounds us, we see that it is fairly stable, that there is variety at all different levels. There's variety in animals, there's variety in plants. What else? The other kingdoms and domains, which are not as obvious or visible to us. When we look out a window into nature, typically we see animals and plants, right? We see mostly plants and then a few animals. But what else is there on the kingdom level and at the domain level that we don't see unless we really look carefully? The third kingdom that is neither animal or plant, the fungi, right? Fungi, which can be either macroscopic, in other words, we can see them, or they can be microscopic. A lot of fungi are macroscopic and under the earth, but they're doing their function. And then the other two domains that are definitely macroscopic, are very important for maintaining life. The bacteria, and even more primitive than the bacteria, the archaea. Remember archaea, which look like bacteria, but they're even more primitive. And that's why they're named archaea. They're ancient archaic, right? Okay, so all living organisms that we look at, we see a tremendous variety, and they seem to be, we would say at first intuition, perfectly adapted to their environment, right? But they're not really perfectly adapted. They're adapted well enough to survive. Under what? What is the assumption? What is what we take for granted? We wake up in the morning, we go out, and we assume that there's going to be weather out there. There's going to be a normal, stable weather. It may vary a little bit. It may be sunshine, it may be rain, it may be overcast, right? But there's a temperature range. We don't expect drastic changes from day to day in the environment, in weather or in volcanic activity or stuff like that, unless we are in a seismic area or a very dangerous area, geologically speaking. So what I'm trying to say is that we assume from day to day a certain stability, a certain fairly narrow range of temperature change, of humidity, of light and darkness, and so forth. Okay? So while the environment stays relatively stable, more or less stable, and what do we call these factors? Are these living factors? They're non-living factors, right? They're called abiotic, non-biotic factors. We're looking at nature, which are the living factors, the biotic factors. But they are adapted to what? They're adapted to the non-living factors, to the temperature range, to the humidity, to the pressure, if it's underwater, etc. Okay? They're adapted to the environmental, to the non-living factors. Okay, so while those abiotic factors stay relatively stable, the species will continue to survive and to thrive and to go through that growth curve until they become stable, right? We saw the population growth curve, which is a sigmoid, is S-shaped, and then the population stabilizes because that's the maximum utilization of resources. And those population of whatever species, from the largest to the smallest organism, stable. What's your intuition when the abiotic factors change, and they may change drastically, as for example, in a cataclysmic event, a volcanic eruption, which would affect a region, more or less a large region, or it could be something like a tsunami, but something that's a little longer range. For example, a meteor coming through the atmosphere and actually hitting the Earth, generating a huge cloud of dust that may stay around for several years. Those are drastic climatological changes. Do you think the species are going to continue happily living and thriving? No, they're going to be tested, right? And there's going to be a struggle for survival there, okay? So the best adapted species, the best adapted phenotypes are expected to survive better. And the least adapted are going to die off. In fact, really, it's a point that Meyer makes that all species on Earth, whether they're small, large, in huge numbers or very few numbers, they're all doomed to die, to become extinct. All species that are around today become extinct. In fact, Meyer makes the point that more than 99% of all the species that have ever existed are extinct today. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because when a species becomes extinct, it opens habitats, it opens niches for new species to evolve and to go into that niche and exploit that niche as a new species. So the fact that species become extinct in the natural setting actually could make an argument for variety, for variation in new species, okay, that are adapted enough to thrive in that environment that was not available for them previously. Okay, a couple of messages here. So here we have a photo of several different mammals that seem to be very well adapted to their environment. I'm sorry, vertebrates, not mammals. There are two mammals here. There are terrestrial mammals and marine mammals. And you see that they look very different from each other. One characteristic of us is that we are bipedal, whereas whales, cetaceans in general, are much better adapted to an ocean environment. So their sizes can be huge because of the buoyancy that the water provides for them and the open space that they have. But since they retain lungs, then they have to figure out a way of breathing inside the water, which they can't actually breathe literally inside the water. Periodically, they have to come to the surface for breathing. And so one adaptation is that the nose has migrated to the top of the head. The snout is at the top of the head, and it's what we call the breathing hole or the blowhole, right? Because this snout also accumulates a little bit of water when the whale is underwater. So the first thing that the whale has to do, it has to clear off that little bit of water that is accumulated on the snout in order to breathe. Otherwise, they're going to get water in their lungs, which is not a good thing. So that's an adaptation. For birds, they have adapted into flight, which is the only large group of animals that have really adapted well of the vertebrates into flight. Of course, of the invertebrates, insects have also adapted fairly well to flight, but especially birds, to the point that some birds can fly for days and weeks and not land. The albatross and some of these marine birds can stretch out their wings and not even flap a wing. They just catch currents and thermals to rise and then fall off the thermal and glide for weeks and weeks. And of course, they'll go down into the ocean to fish and to eat, and then they continue gliding to new territories. Fish, on the other hand, are adapted to actually breathe inside the water with a special adaptation called the gills. We'll look at that in a little more detail. Whereas reptiles have been adapted to crawl very well on land on all four legs, different terrains of land. But we see all these are vertebrates. They all belong to the subgroup of vertebrates, and yet they are adapted into very, very different environments, right? So the first intuition that all of these animals are very well adapted, but they actually have constraints and limitations. They have limitations. Excuse me, let me close this door. Go forward then. In reality, what we have is that all organisms, regardless how well adapted they seem to us, are really rather limited in their adaptation. They're rather limited. For example, if we take a closer look at fish, you would think that they're perfectly adapted to breathing underwater. But they have very specific constraints, all right? To breathe underwater down to the cellular level takes a very sophisticated mechanism, which is called the gill in general. And it's analogous to what the lung does with the alveoli, because both water and air are fluids. It's just that water is a much thicker, much more dense fluid than air, but the air is also a fluid, all right? And so there are analogous structures in that they have the same function, where gills and lungs look very differently, a different phenotype. However, functionally, they have the same function, which is gas exchange in a closed circulatory system. Closed circulatory system means that the blood flows through tubes, through a system of canals that we call blood vessels, all the way from the large arteries and veins down to capillaries, which are the thickness of a single cell. So capillaries are microscopic. And here you have red represented by arterial blood or oxygen-rich blood, and then blue represented by oxygen-poor blood. And there has to be a gas exchange going on here so that the oxygen-poor blood will also have high content of CO2. They're inversely proportional, right? The lower the oxygen, the higher the CO2 on a blood vessel, because the CO2 is a product of respiration, of using up the oxygen. At any rate, that CO2 has to be released into the environment, and at the same time, from the environment, those capillaries, that blood has to pick up oxygen. Now, this is molecular oxygen, right? In other words, O2, which is a solid, liquid, or gas at standard temperature. In the normal temperature range, oxygen, molecular oxygen, O2, is it solid, liquid, or gas?
Gas.
It's gas, right? For example, right now we're breathing O2, right? It's in the gas, it's in the mixture of the atmosphere. Just like nitrogen, N2 is also gas. Just like hydrogen, H2 is also gas in the natural temperature. But here is an animal that is in water, and it has to breathe O2, has to extract O2 from the water. Now, what is the chemical formula for water?
H2O.
H2O, right? So it has how many oxygens? One oxygen atom, and how many hydrogens? 2. But is that the oxygen that the fish breathes? The water oxygen? In other words, is the fish taking up the oxygen from the water molecule? How many say yes? No? Not sure? Okay. No, the answer is no, because that oxygen of the water molecule is not available. It's tied in with the water. It makes the water molecule. It's tied in with 2 hydrogens, and it's a very tight bond. It's not going to let go easily, all right? Not at standard temperature and standard pressure. So there has to be other oxygen that is available for the fish to absorb. And that other oxygen is molecular oxygen, O2, that is mixed into the water column. All right? It's mixed into the water column. I'm sorry, this is a student from the other class that is calling. I'm going to pause for a moment. Give me a minute.
It's also
Yes.
in Jamaica that if you want to preserve the fish
Yes.
frozen for a long time,
Yes.
after you got the fish, do not take the gills out. Freeze the fish with the gill in.
Really?
I have no idea what it has to do with the decay of the fish, but that's the belief.
Interesting.
So I'm just saying that, I'm trying to tie that into this.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And frozen, huh?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why, but it must be.
But it's proven though.
And it actually does work?
Yes, because
Yes.
once you thaw the fish.
Yes.
If you thaw the fish that was frozen with the gill in.
Yes.
And after the fish is thawed, you pull the gill out.
Right.
You're able to still cook that fish 3-4 days after.
Really?
Once you leave it in the fridge.
Really?
But if you do one,
right,
then where the gill is extracted,
right,
before it's frozen,
yes,
you have to eat that in 2 days. You have to fry that in 2 days.
Right away.
Yeah.
Well,
once it's
it doesn't last as long.
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. Could have something to do with the oxygenation,
exactly.
or there's actually a lot of blood accumulated in the gills. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here that taking out the gills may take a substantial amount of blood, with depriving the tissue of that blood, of that nourishment. That's another possibility. Interesting. But what I wanted to point out is that O2, which you see here, molecular oxygen, which is a gas, is mixed in with the water. That is actually called oxygenated water, right? And the ocean needs to be, or whatever water volume the fish is in, that has to be oxygenated. Otherwise, the fish will literally asphyxiate to death. The fish will not find enough water, enough air, enough oxygen that is mixed into the water. Mm-hmm. And so we don't realize what happens at the molecular level, but it's there. The water has to be oxygenated. In other words, the water actually has to have molecular oxygen, gas, mixed in it. Mm-hmm. In fact, that happens to fish, for example, in a pond, because oxygenation, where do you think that oxygenation happens? Where is there an abundance of oxygen, of molecular oxygen for water? At the surface, right? Because that connects with the atmosphere. And the atmosphere has molecular oxygen. And so the mixture happens precisely with the wave action. When the waves break, it is mixing, it is oxygenating the water. It's just like stirring very fast a glass of water, for example, that oxygenates it. Mm-hmm. And so in ponds where the surface doesn't move much and the water is just sitting there, the fish that live in those ponds tend to absorb the oxygen. And if there are not enough plants, that's another source of oxygen, of molecular oxygen, would be the plants that are inside the water, right? Because they're producing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, molecular oxygen. In fact, you see little bubbles. If you look closer, you can see little tiny bubbles coming out of the plants, aquatic plants and marine plants. Well, if there's not enough oxygen, molecular oxygen for the fish to breathe, the fish will asphyxiate to death. Right? Now, some fish have developed a structure on the throat that is called a labyrinth, that allows them to breathe from the surface directly. It's stressful for the fish, but they are able to survive in stagnant water, what we call stagnant water. You know some of those fish, you may have seen them. One group of those fish is the goldfish family, all right? Carps, they breathe from the surface, so you see them gaping at the surface for water. That means that the water column they're in doesn't have sufficient molecular oxygen, all right? The others are the betta fish, the Siamese fighting fish also can breathe from the surface. Guppies can also breathe from the surface. A number of fish have developed that adaptation called a labyrinth, which is something on the throat that allows them to breathe oxygen directly from the surface. But what I'm trying to say is that the gills are actually restrained to work in this fashion, all right, where the water has to flow through the gill in order for the gill to work properly, to release the CO2 and to absorb the oxygen that it needs for living. And so if there's not enough oxygen in the water, or if the water is not flowing through fast enough, the fish will asphyxiate. That's an example of restraints that are by living in the water column. On the other hand, by living on air, like the birds, that also has taken a toll, if you will, in that there's a compromise. The lighter the bird is, then the easier it is for flying, okay? Because the whole basic idea of flying, as you know, just like a plane, it has to get the speed of the air underneath the wing has to be faster than the speed on top of the wing. And that's how they achieve buoyancy in the air. To do that, their bones have become hollow so that the bones of birds are much lighter than the bones of terrestrial animals, say. But the compromise on that is that these bones, being lighter, they're also more brittle and they're more subject to break. Okay, so in general, the skeleton of birds is more fragile. They can afford that because in the case of a predator or something like that, they can lift off and take off, right, and avoid the predator, the land predator, but they have a more delicate bone structure skeleton because of the hollowness of their bones. On the other hand, when we look at reptiles, reptiles don't maintain their own body temperature. They're ectotherms, meaning they don't maintain their body temperature. They're adapted. They seem to be well adapted to the environment, but this issue of not being able to maintain their body temperature means that they have to sun themselves to warm up, all right? And by sunning themselves, and sometimes they spend extended periods of time, hours, sunning themselves just to warm up enough to be able to metabolize and to get moving and hunt something for food, etc. That means that they're more exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Now, they have also adapted by scales, and the scales have fused in turtles, for example. The scales have become fused to make for the carapace or the shell of the turtle. Scales on the outside, and then just on the inside of the scales are the rib cage that is also fused to the underneath of the scales. So those are a very special adaptation. It makes them harder. And scales in general protect somewhat from the UV, but not totally. So reptiles in general are more exposed to UV light, being that they just have to sun themselves to maintain their temperature. And they're also restricted in their range to the tropical, subtropical, and temperate regions. You don't find them in very cold regions. Another adaptation is bipedalism, walking. Now, here we have the design of the knee is what I'm focusing on. We know that our knee bends forward, but it's not really the best design. The biological engineers tell us that a more efficient design would actually be a backward bending knee, like in the case of birds, right? And especially, what are these birds called? There's a name for the, yeah, this is kind of an ostrich. No, it's there's a name for the walking birds in general, like the moas and the ostrich and so forth. Also the wading birds that we see, the heron, for example, the egret that are local, all right? But this is a more efficient design. With this design, the animal can move forward faster because it's springing forward. Instead of here, the knee springs forward, but the weight is behind. So you can see that the leg actually has to drag the body forward. All right. But in this design, the backward bending is more efficient in the sense that the whole body is propelled forward in the unbending of the knee. So it's a more efficient design by to have a backward bending knee. However, on birds, it seems like the knee is bending backward, right? But it's not bending backward. The knee of the bird actually bends forward because they're all vertebrates. These are all vertebrates, and so the legs come from the tetrapods. In all tetrapods, all four legs bend forward. All right, let me go back for a moment. I'm not explaining myself too well, but okay. The back legs bend forward. I'm using the reptile as the reptile as a common ancestor, if you will, for land mammals. Okay. And this forward leg seems like it's bending backward, but it's not really bending backward, it's bending forward. It's just that at the elbow region, the elbow is bending all the way back, okay? But the original leg, if the elbow were to bend forward all the way, that leg is actually bending forward also. So the original tetrapods, all four legs were bending forward. And it's just that over time, the forward legs developed the shoulder region where the leg could twist, rotate further back. But originally, all four legs were forward, just for crawling on land. And so because this design, this has to do with what we call general design as opposed to specific design. The general design of the tetrapod, of the four-legged creatures that moved on to land, the legs were moving forward, the knees were bending forward. However, what has happened, and because birds also developed from reptile ancestors, then their knees, that design was before the specific design of the other bend, calling it the other bend for now. This is what I mean. I'm telling you that the birds, all birds, knees actually bend forward. The problem is that we don't see the knee. The knee is embedded inside the bird. And what we're seeing here is actually the calf. And the calf of mammals bends forward or backward. What's the calf? The calf is between the leg and the foot, right? This articulation down here is the calf, all right? Does the calf bend forward or backward? The calf bends backward, right? The knee bends forward, right? But the calf bends backward, right? The calf is bending backwards, okay, opposite. So this is the calf. This, what seems to be the knee of the bird, is actually the calf. Let me show you. All right, let's start with the hip. The hip, and here's the socket of the femur, right? And here's the femur, the longest bone in mammals, but not in birds. Red is the femur. And then the tibia, which is the next, is the lower part. We have tibia and fibula, all right? The tibia, the chin, all right, this bone here, is in blue for the human, for mammals. And look at where it is on the bird. See? So actually, the knee of the bird is this one here. That's the knee of the bird, which is embedded inside the body. Here is this little diagram shows the contour of the body. It's a generalized bird with a skeleton. And you see the contour of the body here, further down. Okay, so look at where the knee is. The knee is actually embedded inside the bird. Inside the abdominal region. And here is illustrated. And then, by the time we get down here, the green is the tarsus, or this region of the foot, all those little bones that we have articulated at the level of the foot, all right? These have adapted, of course, for bipedalism. But that's what looks like the lower part of the leg of the bird. It's actually elongated tarsus, and then the other bones have degenerated.
No fibula?
Sorry?
The fibula, isn't the other one?
Tibia and fibula, yeah, the fibula would be this one here on the back side, which they also have it. This is a generalized bird, but some birds have a little tiny fibula here, but it would be parallel to the tibia, all right? And sometimes it's not even attached, fully attached. So it's kind of degenerate. But here, then you have the metatarsus, the smaller bones leading toward the actual digits. The digits are the toes, the fingers, okay? But this part is the metatarsus, and that's what constitutes essentially the foot of the bird. But the point is that the knee is embedded inside the body of the bird. So what seems to be the backward bending knee of a bird, that's why I put it in quotations, is not really the knee, it's the calf. And what has happened is that the tarsus has elongated tremendously. So it's a further adaptation. It's what we call a specific adaptation. The general adaptation is the leg, is a tetrapod, having 4 legs, which again in the birds, the 4 legs, the forward legs, F-O-R-E, 4 limbs, right, have developed into, have specialized into wings. But again, you see the bones here that correspond to the radius, the cubitus, and then the carpals of the hand, and finally the digits, degenerate digits for flight.
I think that's what it's called, a digigrade, isn't it?
Digigrade?
I think that's
yes, for the birds?
Yeah.
Okay, digigrade, which is kind of degenerate in there. And sometimes this one sticks out, would be equivalent to the thumb, I guess. Okay, further adaptation. Again, these are all vertebrates, the 5 groups of vertebrates: fish, amphibian, reptile, mammals, birds. And you see that they seem to be well adapted to their specific environment. In other words, their skeletal structure. First of all vertebrates, by definition, they have internal skeleton and also a segmented vertebral column, segmented cord, which allows for rigidity and flexibility at the same time. All right, but each one of these is perfectly adapted, or well adapted, rather, we would say well adapted to their particular environment. And what are we looking at here? Of the 4 levels of phenotype, talked about 4 levels of phenotype of any organism. What are those 4 levels, or 4 types of phenotypes? We were to break down phenotype into 4 categories. We have the morphological, or the structure. We have the physiological, or the functioning, the metabolism, right? Then we have what? The behavioral, right? And then molecular, which is going deep into the structural and functional, really. Because metabolism at the molecular level is about biochemistry, is about enzymes and biochemical processes. And also structurally, what makes a structure at the molecular level? Well, molecules, precisely macromolecules that come together to give a structure, mostly polymers. So we're looking here at face value. When we look at skeletons, we're looking mostly at morphology, structure, right? We're looking at structure, the internal structure, the skeletal structure. But we can also intuit, or we can infer, rather, we can infer from the structure. What can we infer? From the morphology, sometimes we can infer the physiology, the function. And we can also infer the behavior. Okay, so for example, this, which is obviously a fish, the skeleton of a fish, what is its behavior? What is its lifestyle? Swimming, aquatic. And we can see that the skeleton is generally adapted to swimming and not flying, for example, or crawling. Okay? In contrast to that, the other 4 groups are terrestrial. So they're adapted to some kind of movement on land. The frog, which is amphibian, is definitely crawling and leaping. So you see the hind legs are much longer than the forward legs for the leaping. So the structure is adapted fairly well to the particular environment, the niche that they're going to take. Whereas serpents, which are reptiles, they're super adapted, specialized to what? To crawling and slithering. It's a wave-like motion. So they have developed a huge amount of vertebrae to protect the internal organs as they crawl through the ground. And their legs actually have become degenerate and vestigial, but they still have, at the end of the abdominal region, they have a little region here which has a very degenerate hip. Degenerate hip. And then the tail, in fact, on the underneath, there's a distinctive feature here, snakes being reptiles, they have scales for covering, right? And on the underside, the scales are double until they get to the anus, which is the abdominal region here, where the hip is, or remnants of the hip. And then from that region forward, down into the tail, the scales are single instead of double. It's a particular feature of most snakes. But the point is that you can see that they have developed an excess amount of ribs precisely to maintain basically the whole body as a huge rib cage. Whereas their legs have degenerated totally. On the other hand, mammals in general are tetrapods, which means that they walk on all 4 legs. And typically the tail is to counterbalance the projection of the body forward, to counterbalance on the hip region. And finally, birds, we talked about. Again, the structure tells us that they're very well adapted to flight and possibly to running fast, but especially flight because the forward limbs have developed into wings, which allow them to take off. Okay. So we can see from the morphology, from the morphological phenotype, from the skeleton, that each organism seems to be well adapted, but only well adapted to a particular environment, not to all possible environments. If we look at invertebrates, a large group of animals are the arthropods that seem to be very well adapted also to land and to flight and to water, whether it's freshwater or saltwater. We see that they have some very specific adaptations which vary quite a bit from group to group, whether they are crustaceans, like the crab or the lobster, or they are coleopters, they are beetles, or insects like the grasshopper, or lepidopters, butterflies, arachnids. Arachnids are the scorpions and spiders, or the millipedes. You can see that they are super specialized. They look very different from each other, yet they have some very general characteristics, which are that they all have an exoskeleton, external skeleton, which is made out of chitin, by the way, it's a protein. And they also have articulated legs. All right, all of the arthropods have articulated legs. In fact, they're named after that. Arthro meaning articulation. Pod is a reference to the leg. Podia, legs. Okay, so articulated legs is a common feature of all arthropods, no matter where they live, and the great variety of adaptations that they have. They're all restrained by an exoskeleton, which also restrains their size, because the exoskeleton is hard, it hardens. And then the animal literally needs to crawl out of that exoskeleton to grow a little bit and then form a new skeleton on the outside. It's by secretions. Once that hardens, then the animal is fixed to that size until the next molting season.
Is that true of arachnids?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and for years I had never seen an arachnid scale, and one time I found one. Remind me, I'll bring it to the next class. The spiders that we have around here, the banana spiders, okay? One day I found a skeleton, an exoskeleton of a banana spider, but the abdomen is missing. And I think it probably got eaten because the abdomen is softer, even though it's also part of the exoskeleton. The whole animal is encased in this exoskeleton, but the abdomen is softer, and it probably got eaten away by something before I found that little skeleton. Okay, so we can see also in birds, there are general adaptations then, like legs for tetrapods, all right, gills for fish, but then there are specific adaptations for groups within those large adaptations. Then there will be specific adaptations. For example, the different types of wings and feathers that are for the birds, all right? These are all specific phenotypes, very different shapes of wings, as you can see. It's all according to what? You expect the shape of the wing to be according to what? To the function of the wing. If the wing is meant to fly short distances from branch to branch or from adjacent trees, or if the wing is designed to, to glide for long periods of time at relatively high altitude, right, in open air, like on top of the ocean, and things like that. So the wing is going to be designed according to its function. Remember, form follows function. The structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. The same we can say about the feather, depending on where the feather is on the body of the bird, the particular shape that it has, because the shape has to do with its function. If it's going to serve either for protection, for maintaining the body warmth, or if it's actually going to serve for gliding and directing. You know that the tips of the long wings of birds, those feather tips are the ones that actually glide in fine-tuning the motion of the actual bird, okay? So, for example, some birds can be restricted from flying at all if the tips of the first wings are cut off, just the tips of the first 2 or 3 feathers. If those are cut off, that bird will not be able to fly. That's true for some birds, not all, but for some. So that wing tip plays literally a crucial role in the flight of that particular bird.
In Jamaica,
yes,
we raise pigeons.
Yes.
And the only way you keep the pigeon at home is to rip out that feather.
Yes, the tip.
So they can fly. And
yeah.
If they do fly, they can't fly very far.
Right.
So
1 or 2.
Be able to fly, you drop put them out.
Yes, exactly, the wingtip. And some feathers can be grown back, but I understand for adult birds, the feather tips, these tips typically don't grow back once they are established adults, right? They don't grow it back. Right. So that's for the advantage that it provides, it becomes a permanent structure. So that is like the Achilles heels, if you will, of the bird, because there is that's actually a delicate point. It's a vulnerable point of the bird for the advantage that it provides for flight. In fact, so for the past few years, planes also, we mimic in artificial selection, we mimic nature. And you've noticed the wings, maybe most of you are too young to remember, but I remember clearly a time when the wings of planes were flat. At the tip, they were flat, all right? But now you notice that most commercial planes, the wingtip is curled up. Have you noticed that the wingtip is curled up like this? All right, that's an adaptation that is precisely mimicking the wingtips of large birds, of predator birds, for example, eagles and large predator birds, birds of prey that can fly down at a fast speed, and when they get close to the surface, they just move just the wingtip because their wings are close into their body. They just move the little wingtip, and that bird does a 180 degree with practically the same speed that it was coming down. It will now go up. Of course, it will extend its talons to catch the prey. And so it's just the wingtip, a slight movement, millimeters, will make a shift in the direction of the bird 180 degrees and prevents the bird from crashing. Well, finally, aerodynamic engineers figured that out, and now many commercial flights, many commercial planes have the wingtip turned so that it's a much smoother flight for the captain, for the pilot. This applies also to plants and to fungi and to all living organisms, all right? Plants are not exempt from adaptation. In fact, you notice conifers are very well adapted to a cold environment. So instead of leaves, they have needles, which give much less exposure, especially what's the big abiotic factor? What's the environmental factor that is driving the shape of the needle as opposed to a leaf? What happens up north in the winter when it rains? That rain drops crystallize and become snow, right? That falls slowly and starts accumulating. And water is very heavy. And so when you get a lot of snow, it would, on a leaf would accumulate a lot of snow on top of it and will snap it off, right? Just the weight itself. I'm not thinking other factors like cold or something like that, but the actual weight would snap off the leaf. But a needle offers very little resistance, because very little snow can actually accumulate there. All right, so the needle, definitely the formation of the needle has been driven by the weight of the snow specifically. Also, they have cones instead of flowers, because you notice that the flower is a relatively tender structure that would be subject to burning with the cold, but a cone is very hard and resistant, it's very woody, and this is the reproductive structure of pine trees, of conifers. In fact, that's what they call conifer, cone-bearing trees. And typically these are the female cones that are larger. In the other lecture, I'll show you some examples of the male cone, which is much smaller. So the eggs are embedded inside the ovaries at the center of the cone, of the pine cone. And at the base of the ovary would be all the tiny little ova, the eggs. So each scale, at the base of each scale would be a little microscopic egg waiting to be fertilized by pollen grains. So here's a closed cone because it's not mature yet. Those eggs are not mature. Once the eggs are mature, it receives environmental signals and so forth, and then the cone opens up ready to be fertilized. Another adaptation of the conifers is a tap root, as opposed to secondary roots that would spread out on the ground and remain generally more superficial, because in very cold weather, of course, there's going to be humidity trapped inside the soil. And if that temperature goes below 0 degrees centigrade, or what Fahrenheit? 32 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing, that water starts freezing. And the roots, the superficial roots, would not have access to that water and so forth. It's a problem. So conifers have also developed a tap root, a principal root that goes very deep into the soil, where it's generally warmer down there, more stable, and there's more access to liquid water even in the wintertime. And I have to tell you that tap roots are anywhere from half or 3/4 of the shoot system. There are two parts to the tree, right? The root system is below ground, and the shoot, what is known as the shoot system, is above ground. What we see of a tree is called the shoot system, anything that shoots up from the ground. Roots, typically for conifers, can be anywhere from half the size of the shoot to 3 or 4 times the size of the shoot. Okay, so they're very, very deep roots. And that's why conifers, once they get established, they're practically impossible to transplant. The other problem is that the tip of the root tip, all right, is the region of growth. Actually, it's the only region of new growth for the root. And if that root tip breaks off, then the whole root dies. If the root dies, the whole tree dies. So the root tip is very tender, is deep, is small, and it's very tender. If it breaks, eventually the whole tree will die. So they're hard to transplant, the conifers, once they become established. Okay, but they're adapted to their particular environment, which is typically a more drastic environment with regards to temperature, large temperature range from summer to winter, freezing and thawing and so forth. And that's why it's so special about these pine trees here is that they have adapted to the subtropical environment, which is much more benevolent. General adaptations, these are all mammals. You can see that we have a wide range of adaptations, but regardless of the adaptation of the mammal, they all have 4 legs. And if they don't have 4 legs, then they have the rudiments of 4 legs. So for example, the most drastic example are the cetaceans, again, the whales, dolphins, and also another cetacean is the, around here, the manatee and the dugong, all those are marine mammals. Used to be tetrapods, meaning they had 4 legs and then they migrated back into the water. So the front flipper, this one is the rudiment, what's left of the front legs. This is mostly the digits, okay? And the hind limbs are totally degenerate and reabsorbed into the body, but they do have rudiments of a hip structure. Cetaceans do. Also, bats, which are mammals, have a super adapted for flight. So the 4 limbs, forward limbs, have adapted so that the digits are very elongated, and then there is skin growth, skin flap in between the fingers. But these are actually the phalanges, the digits, the fingers that have adapted for flight. Okay. But regardless of what mammal we think of, they all have 4 legs because it's one of the common characteristics. And also they have hair as opposed to scales or feathers. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about what are general adaptations of a whole class of organisms, and then the specific adaptations, which typically come later and make that plant or animal or fungus better adapted to that particular environment. Remember that dictum ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was a common belief when scientists started looking at the embryonic development of different organisms and noticing their similarity, but that in a strict sense, ontogeny does not really recapitulate phylogeny. Let's think about that. Ontogeny, what is genus, is a reference to the beginning, the origin, all right? Like the book of Genesis is the book of origin. So onto is being, so ontogeny is the origin of the individual being, of the individual organism, of each one of us. Our individual biological origin inside our mother's womb, all right? Phylogeny is the origin of the phylum, of the entire group of humans, of the entire group of mammals. Where did we come from as a group, right? Ontogeny and phylogeny. And so it was thought at first that through embryonic development, here's the embryonic development of the human in big steps, from the zygote to the morula, to the early embryo, and to more fully developed fetus until birth. Now, it was noticed the striking similarity of the embryonic development of different organisms, of different groups of organisms. All these are vertebrates. And so originally it was thought that in the development of the human, for example, we would go through a fish stage, and then an amphibian stage, and then a reptile phase, and then even a bird phase, and eventually end up with the mammal phase. You see? That would be ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny in a strict sense. But it's not really that way, because we don't change species during the embryonic development, do we? We are the same species throughout the entire embryonic development, from fertilization. In fact, fertilization could not happen if it was not the same species that is fertilizing. And so we maintain our ontogeny from fertilization forward. But there are common characteristics. There are phylogenetic characteristics that are common. And those phylogenetic characteristics are more common the earlier we go in the embryonic stage. Okay? What's the earliest that we can go in the embryonic stage? The zygote, the fertilized egg. Whether it's a human, a monkey, a pig, a chicken, or a salamander, or we can put a fish here, all right? At the zygote level, we all look alike. Basically, a fertilized egg. So it's going to be a round ball that is diploid, that has a full complement of chromosomes, 50% coming from the mother, the other 50% coming from the father, whoever that mother or father is. But my point is that at the zygote level, all vertebrates, and in fact, all animals look alike. What would be a basic difference? Maybe we saw a morphological difference between all these fertilized eggs, because all these zygotes. What would be a morphological difference that we could see? Just the size, just strictly the size. To the point that a cow egg, for example, a cow zygote, a cow fertilized egg, is maybe 10 to 20 times bigger than a human fertilized egg, and one can actually see with plain eye a little tiny dot of a cow fertilized egg, a cow zygote. You can see with plain eye, this is much bigger. All right, but that's about it. For the rest, it's just a ball.
So a marine mammal would be, that was my question.
Yes.
A marine mammal would be much larger.
Much larger, but that's about it. It'll still be a round ball. So the first, I don't know how large actually the whale fertilized egg is, a whale ovum, but it would be the same size as the mature ovum. All right. But that's about it. The rest is just a single cell that is a ball. Then that ball starts dividing through mitosis, but maintaining pretty much the same size overall. It's a process, it's another way, it's a process called compaction, where the cells, as the cells subdivide, they become smaller, but they keep generally the same size, at least until implantation. And there's a type of hatching, we'll go over that next semester, that happens even with mammals, even though we don't have an egg as such, an egg shell, but there is an analogous to a hatching that happens at implantation. I'll talk about that further next course. My point is that at the morula stage, we again look very similar between different species, between different groups of vertebrates. Okay. Then we start getting differences as we go further into embryonic development. For example, the salamander and the fish and the chicken are all going to have a yolk sac, whereas mammals will not have a yolk sac, because instead we develop what? We develop a placenta, which is going to be our source of nourishment during the embryonic stage. John, you had a question?
Is the morula the same as the blastula?
No. The morula is before. So you got zygote, and as the zygote starts splitting through mitosis, right? Duplicating its number of cells. Eventually, from the 4-8 cell stage forward, you have the morula, which just means tiny berry. Mora, it comes from mora in Spanish, in Latin. Mora is like raspberry, all right? When they were looking at these under the microscope, primitive microscope, they looked like a little berry. So it's the diminutive of mora, it's morula. And that's the morula. And then the blastula, or in our case, blastocyst, is the third stage of development when you already have an anterior part of the body and a posterior. Actually, this is the fourth stage. This is the gastrula. The blastula is not really shown here. Is when you get two cell layers. You get the ectoderm, right? The inner cell mass and the blast ectoderm on the outside. The trophoblast on the outside and the inner cell mass. Then you have cellular differentiation. So the first cellular differentiation, you go to blastula or blastocyst.
Blastocyst is the embryo.
Yes, it is. Well, the whole thing is the embryo. It's just that the embryo proper will come from the ICM, the inner cell mass, whereas the trophoblast, the outside, will become the placenta. But the placenta still belongs to the embryo. It's an organ. It's an external organ of the embryo itself. Okay, so the other aspect, for example, gill slits, all right? It's kind of tiny here, but again, we'll see in the next course in more detail, but actual slits on the neck region of mammals. Gill slits, all right? I'm emphasizing gill slits. Now, those gill slits in amphibians and in fish will continue to develop into actual gills on the inside of the slit. The gill slit is just the opening, all right? But you need actual functional gills inside for the whole structure to be functional. So those will continue to develop into actual gills in the amphibians and in the fish. In the fish, the gills will survive until the adult stage. In the amphibians, the gills are shed. In the juvenile, when the juvenile goes onto land and becomes an adult, the gills are shed and the lungs take over. So amphibians develop gills first, but they also have lungs that eventually become functional when they go onto land. Okay? Whereas in the rest of the embryos, the early bird embryos and the mammal embryos, we have the slits, but we don't have the gills on the inside of the slit. So they're non-functional, they're vestigial, but they're there. So it's another, remember when we're talking about comparative embryology, it's another comparison, it's another indication that we all come from common ancestors. But it doesn't mean the fact that we, in the early embryo, that we have gill slits, it doesn't mean that we were fish, or that we go through a fish stage. Okay, we're always mammals, we're always Homo sapiens, but we have vestigial structures that point to a common ancestor, which is now dead and extinct, a common ancestor for all vertebrates. And that's what the vestigial structures mean. Okay. So you see the ontogeny is the development of the individual, phylogeny is the development of the whole group, and there are similarities. The general similarities will be first, the specific similarities will be later in development. Also, adaptation comes at a price, trying to make that point through this whole first lecture, that adaptation comes at a price. For example, here is a marine turtle. Now, what are turtles? Are they fish? Are they amphibians? Are they birds? What are they? They're reptiles, okay? They're tetrapods, so 4 legs, but these reptiles have adapted back to the ocean. However, there is a clear indication that these marine reptiles, now marine reptiles, sea turtles, right? Their ancestors came from land. How can we tell that? Well, if we do an X-ray of a turtle, what do we find inside the turtle? We find lungs, all right? And lungs come from breathing air on land. Because in the water, if these marine turtles had never been on land, never developed from land animals, they would have gills instead of lungs, all right? So the fact that marine turtles, sea turtles have lungs means that their ancestors had to come from land, that they were land-breathing animals. So they are adapted to being in the water for an extended period of time, But periodically, because they have lungs and they don't have gills, periodically they have to come to the surface to breathe also, just like the marine mammals, all right? So the adaptation comes at a price. They were able to go back to land where the ancestors, to water where the ancestors came from, all right, and adapt fairly well. But this periodic come up to the surface, it's dangerous at the surface. It exposes them. They're more vulnerable to predators at the surface, okay? So there's a trade-off, which is that they are more vulnerable at the surface, and so they breathe quickly and then go down and hold their breath for quite some time, sometimes even hours. As we put this whole picture together of adaptation of populations of species into populations in nature, all right, we come up with communities. Now, communities will be a particular geographical region, a relatively local, relatively small geographical region that has what? Has a variety, either a large or a small variety of many different species living together, of many different populations. They're not exploiting the same niche. They could not exploit the same niche because they could not live together if they were exploiting the same niche. So they're exploiting different niches within that geographical region. So here is a typical community of a forest, a deciduous forest, known as a deciduous forest, meaning that these trees shed their leaves in the fall. That's precisely the word of fall. The leaves, fall off. And you see that they can live in harmony. Some will be predators, some will be prey, but there are many animals and plants and fungi and bacteria that are all going to live in this particular community because they will exploit different niches. So that's the next level, right? A community. And that's what we actually see in nature. We don't just see isolated populations floating around. They are in context. The context is a local geographical region where different species, different populations coexist. All right? And to what, so what makes this community, what turns this community into an ecosystem? When we talk about community, we're only talking about what? We're only talking about the biotic factors. We're only talking about the living organisms, or even the dead organisms. But we only talk about organisms, okay? To turn this community into an ecosystem, we need to add to the picture, we need to include in the picture what?
Abiotic.
The abiotic factors, exactly. The temperature, the weather, the climate, the humidity, the topography, right? The seasonal changes, etc., etc. All right? That would be then a whole ecosystem. So really what we see in nature is ecosystems. We don't just see, again, just communities floating around, because those communities don't exist in a vacuum. They are influenced by the abiotic factors, by the environmental. So when we study ecology, for example, we have to keep all these complexities in mind. And we dissect them, we parse them out for the sake of study. But in nature, they all live together in that beautiful, elegant complexity that we call life, organic life here on Earth. So the ecosystem is the real picture out there. When we put several ecosystems together within a large geographical region, then we come up with biomes, right? And then the half dozen or so biomes of the world make the biosphere. That applies also to the oceans, which is 3/4 of the world's surface is ocean. Okay? So we have generally 3 regions. We have the pelagic region, the open region, and then the benthic region is on the bottom. Actually, this is all pelagic. This is all open water. We have many different species that live toward the surface where there is sunlight, typically within 10 meters or 30 feet of depth, more or less, which is 1 atmosphere of pressure. All right. Then we have that mid-region where light is scarce, especially the red light, the red side of the spectrum is the shorter wavelengths, and then the ones that tend to penetrate further is on the blue range of the spectrum. And therefore, there's a twilight region where you see that many of the animals lose a lot of coloring because there's no need for it, all right? There's not enough light to see the different colors anyway. And finally, when you get into the benthic region or the deep ocean, it's mostly either, the animals are either black or red because they look the same at that depth. Also to note that many animals don't have a full range of color vision like we do. Some animals only see black and white or different shades. I understand that sharks, for example, see black and white, but they can also see red, and that's why they can zero in on blood. But not all animal eyes have the full range of color vision that we have. Okay, but again, here you have communities, populations forming communities, and then when we add the abiotic factors, we have actually ecosystems in the ocean. This could apply also to lakes. I talked about some of the restrictions of adaptation, just to recap. For birds, for example, hollow bones to make a lighter structure. For fish, they have developed a hydrodynamic shape, which allows them to break through the density of the water column and actually be able to propel. And there are all kinds of adaptation here. If we look at it at a section, the scales actually overlap slightly to minimize friction that is normally going to happen by moving through the water column. And even beyond the scales, typically fish produce also a mucus that surrounds the outside of the body that is both for protection against bacteria and fungi, and also that mucus sloughs off at the very edge of it to minimize resistance to the water column as much as possible. We talked about the best adaptation of the leaf for photosynthesis is to be facing flat up so that the sun will hit it, but there's an actual angle that is the normal angle of a leaf, because that flatness would only apply really at the tropics where the sun is coming more perpendicular, but in the other temperate regions, the sun is a little bit of an angle. So the leaves have actually adapted to that angle to have the best exposure to sunlight possible, okay? Another example is the eye. The eye of fish is adapted to the ocean to being able to see through water, which is, again, a much thicker fluid than seeing through air. And so the lens of the human eye is much smaller than the lens of the fish eye. In fact, I don't know if you've seen those photographs of fish eye photograph, right? When they use the fish eye lens that opens and has, fish eye lens has a lot of peripheral vision, and it magnifies what is in front of it. So that lens of the eye is meant for seeing underwater. So it's a special adaptation. So you understand there are general adaptations of the group as a whole, all right? Like for example, for mammals, hair and tetrapods, internal body temperature. But then there are specific adaptations that have to do with particular class. For example, the difference between carnivores and herbivores mammals. What's a herbivore animal? What's a herbivore mammal? Grass eating, cows, cattle, right? Their teeth structure is very different from a carnivore. What's a carnivore animal? A mammal. Tiger, cat, just a cat, an alley cat. You notice their structure of the teeth is the canines and for tearing, as opposed to grinding for the herbivore. They're both mammals, but those would be specific adaptations, as opposed to the general adaptations of all mammals. That also applies to the group of mammals as a whole, for example, where we have placental and we have marsupials. This is a process called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is a very interesting process. And again, it's another confirmation that evolution occurs, where you have groups of animals that have separated. They have geographical isolation that is very large and extensive, like, for example, different continents, 2 different continents, with a whole ocean in between. There's no way that those 2 groups of mammals are going to have recent interaction, all right? So they have separated a long time ago. They're mammals, and therefore they have a common ancestor, okay? But those 2 groups have separated a long time ago, and the largest separation in the mammals is precisely between what is known as the placental and the marsupial mammals, all right? So what are placental mammals? We're an example, okay, but there are many, many other examples. Basically, any mammal that you can think of in North America, all right, and in South America, with a couple of exceptions, and Europe, and Africa, they're all placental mammals, all right? Give me another mammal from here, from Miami, that is not a human. Dolphin, okay. About cats and dogs and many other mammals that we see around, all right? Okay, these are all placental. What does that mean? We're mammals, so we have internal fertilization, right? But there's also internal development. And there is a placenta to feed the embryo, to feed the fetus. So there's a placenta that attaches to the mother, and that maintains the embryonic development of mammals, of placental mammals. All right? So that happens in the placental mammals. They have a placenta. But then there are this other group of mammals. In other words, they have hair, they have internal body temperature, and they have 4 legs, right? Some have tails, some don't, but they are marsupial. Because they have a marsupials, they have a pouch, okay? And they're not placental. If they're marsupial, they're not placental. What does that mean? That these mammals don't have a placenta. If they don't have a placenta, their embryonic development is not finished inside the mother. Only the early embryonic development. And then the little fetus has to crawl out prematurely because there's no placenta. How's the fetus going to grow? The fetus is a little tiny, wiggly little creature that is soft, almost no hair, all right? And has to crawl out of the mother, to be delivered prematurely, bless you, and crawl out and crawl into the pouch. And what is that marsupial little fetus going to find inside the pouch, which is not very visible and evident, but we'll see some examples. But what is inside the pouch of the marsupial? Typically, there is 1 tit. There's 1 tit there, okay? And that is going to be the feeding mechanism for that little marsupial. Because they're mammals, in other words, they feed on the mammary glands. So marsupials have mammary glands that typically have 1 tit that is long inside the pouch. And what that little fetus has to do once it crawls in there, it starts suckling on that little tit, and it actually swallows the tit, all right? So it's a long gland like that. And it swallows, almost connects all the way down into the stomach. And that is the analogous of a placenta. It has the same function. It's a different structure altogether. A tit looks very different from a placenta, all right? But it has the analogous function. In other words, a little fetus is latched on to that tit, and that's the milk of the mother will go to the stomach of that little fetus for several months until the little kid develops, all right? And will come out of the pouch like a little baby kangaroo or a wombat or one of these other Australian mammals. And so Australia separated from mainland rest of the world so early on that there was only time for development of mammals, but then separation. So that marsupials, the mammals in Australia, did not develop a placenta. It was before the development of placenta, okay? So they're more primitive that way. whereas the other mammals in the other 4 continents developed a placenta. 5, we include also Asia. However, many of the marsupial animals and the placental mammals have developed analogous structures. Their phenotype, their external morphology looks very similar because they actually grew up in similar environments, even though there is a drastic geographic separation, an entire ocean in between those groups of mammals, but they develop similar structures because they're inhabiting similar niches or similar habitats. So for example, we have, okay, so on the diagrams here, there are pairs. There are pairs of mammals, and the top are the marsupials, and the bottom are of the pair. The bottom are the placental. Okay, so for example, the flying squirrel that is in North America, and it's also in South America, and it's also I think in Europe. But it's a flying squirrel. It's actually a placental mammal. All right, there is a similar structure creature mammal that is called a glider in Australia. And you can see it has developed that flap of skin in between the forward limbs and the hind limbs to have, because it glides from tree to tree just like the flying squirrel does over here in the New World. All right. Also, the mouse has its equivalent in it's a little it's called a marsupial mouse. But it's not a mouse at all in that it doesn't have a placenta. It has a pouch. It has a marsupial. Okay, and so that is because it crawls on the ground and eats seeds and so forth, just like the mouse does. It has the same niche habitat. Another one that actually crawls into the ground. We have moles in North America and in Europe. There are moles, and also there is an Australian mole, a marsupial mole that looks very similar, with the extended claws and the front limbs and so forth. Then, at the level of hunters, we have, for example, the wolf, the Canis lupus here, and there is a Tasmanian wolf or Tasmanian tiger, which has a similar body structure than the hunting wolf over here. Another one that chews on wood, like the woodchuck or the what's the other one? The marmot. There is an equivalent called the common wombat in Australia, again for the adaptation of that niche. At the level of eating insects, we have the anteater, for example, in Africa, and there's an anteater in South America also, and there is this banded anteater, or numbat, in Australia, which also has, it doesn't show, but it also has a long, oh yeah, can you barely see it? It has a long, sticky tongue, tubular tongue, the same way as the placental anteater. Has a long tongue for sucking out the ants from the holes. Finally, also similar to the leopard, which is a placental animal, there is the native cat, called a spotted tail native cat, that has similar adaptation to a similar environment. Okay? This is known as parallel or convergent evolution. They converge on analogous structures, even though they are not related, or they're very distantly related, only at the level of being mammals. All right. It happens in birds also. For example, this is the honey creeper from Australia that has adapted to sucking nectar from flowers. But Australia, you know, is an archipelago of islands that is very far removed from the continent, certainly from North America. And in North America, we also have the hummingbird, which has adapted its beak to sucking nectar from flowers. So it's another example of convergent evolution or parallel evolution. Animals that are only distantly related in the sense that they are birds, but they're living in a similar environment. They're exploiting a similar niche, which is the nectar of the local flowers, which were, again, those flowers are going to be different flowers, right? But the common adaptation is that they have a nectar. African porcupine and American porcupine. Again, a striking difference, even though they're separated by an entire continent, the Atlantic Ocean, or two separate continents. It happens in plants also. And this one I highlight in particular because we already talked about the adaptations of pine trees, of conifers, to weather. One aspect that is similar in weather, either for pine trees or for the Australian pine, is that it's dry, particularly in winter, because there is little liquid water available. There is water, but the water is solid. So that translates into dry. In fact, what happens when we go up north, in the wintertime, our skin gets dry, right? Because the atmosphere sucks out humidity from all living creatures. So that aspect of dryness is what has driven these Australian pines, which are not real pines. They are actually flowering plants, so they're deciduous plants, but they have, through what is known as convergent evolution, they have adapted and evolved parallel structures, okay, structures that look similar, but really have a very different origin. So we talked about the cones of pine cones, of pine trees, and the needles, which are true needles and true cones. Whereas for the Australian pine, that's why I have it in quotations, it's not a real pine at all. It's not a conifer. It's an angiosperm. In other words, it is a flowering plant. It's a flowering tree. But when we look at the structures just to the simple eye, they seem to be needles, right? And they seem to be little cones. You've seen this around. These are actually invasive, and they're a pest in Miami. They're throughout the Caribbean also, the Australian pine. We have them here in the property. It's a strand that is invaded into the forest. When we look in detail, the needles, the so-called needles, are not needles at all. First of all, they're segmented, all right? They're segmented. They're not a single needle like a true pine cone, a pine needle. They're segmented, and if we look even closer, what we find is actually little leaflets that have collapsed onto the twig. So each one of these segments is a twig, and it's surrounded by an average of anywhere from 7 or 8 to a dozen leaves that have collapsed onto the twig very tightly to preserve water, precisely to preserve from desiccation, from dehydration, all right? But if we look in detail, we see that these are little leaflets, okay? And that's how you can tell the different species of Australian pine, depending on how many leaflets they have around the twig. So that then when we see what we think looks like a needle, it's actually a whole branch. It's a branch that is made up of twigs, and each little twig, each little segment is surrounded by its leaflets that are collapsed onto the twig. At the level of what looks like a cone, because it's hard and crusty and woody, like a real pine cone, actually when we look at it in detail, they put out little flowers. So it's not a conifer at all. Conifers don't have flowers, okay? These are angiosperms. They produce flowers. And what we see is actually this woody structure, crusty woody structure. This is actually a complex leaf. It's a compound, it's a compound flower. Each one of these little slits is one of these little crusts is a flower in itself. Little tiny flower that will be on the inside, and fertilization has to occur inside there. So this is certainly an analogous structure to the cone, but it has a very different origin altogether, okay? Because these are angiosperms. They also put out seeds that are winged seeds, similar to the pine cone that have winged seeds for aerial, for wind distribution, wind dispersal. But these pine trees, these Australian pines, or actually Casuarina is their genus name, developed in Australia totally independently from the true pine trees that developed in Europe, in Asia, and in America.
So analogous just means that they look similar because they have a similar environment.
Yes, exactly. So there you have it. Form follows function. Because they are in a similar habitat, they have developed similar morphology, similar structures, but they have a very different origin. Okay, so they're not homologous structures, they're analogous structures. They're structures that have a similar function, but they have a different origin because they have been separated by millions of years. But this is proof that evolution has occurred, adaptation to the local environment. One final example of convergent evolution, if you will, is the eye. The eye has developed many times in evolution, independently of the different phylogenetics. So for example, here's a human eye. It's a very complex but a single eye, all right? Contrasted to a fly eye, which is compound. Each one of these little rhomboids is actually an eyelid, all right, or it's an eyelet. So this is a compound eye, which can have dozens or even hundreds of eyelets integrated, and each one gives like a checkerboard sketch of what's out there. But insects are not, we're not derivatives of insects. The insects do not derive from us either. Mammals and insects diverged millions and millions of years ago, and yet both phylogenies, both branches have developed eyes independently from each other. And so flatworms like the planaria, they have eye spots, which can just detect shadow and light and shadow, all right? They don't actually see contours, they can just detect light from darkness, but these are eye spots on flat worms, Platyhelminthes, which again branched off millions and millions of years from the arthropods, from the insects, and from the mammals, from the vertebrates. Another example, these are actual eyes in mollusk. This is a clam. And these are many, many eyes. They're single, simple eyes, but many of them independently on the clam, on the edge of the clam shell, which again, the mollusks developed independently as its own phylogeny, millions and millions of years from us. Bless you. And so an example is the eye that has developed many, many times independently in nature because of the big, what is the big stimulus that is driving the eye? The formation of the eye, the development of eye. What is the big stimulus? What's the abiotic factor? Light, exactly. And then the range of light, right? Because this white light is actually the dirtiest light. It has the more wavelengths. And then associated with light, then contour and the detection of shapes and the possibility of seeing the predator coming and so forth, or actually seeing the prey. So there's certainly a lot of stimulus for developing eye, okay? Because it's a very obvious, very evident abiotic factor, environmental factor that is out there on an average every day. Okay, questions, comments? No? So we see then adaptiveness is, we look at the environmental, we look at ecosystems, and we see, at first we think that all the organisms out there are perfectly adapted to their environment, but not really. There's no perfect adaptation. They're best adapted to their environment, okay? They're best adapted. Why don't we see much change then? Normally in our own lifetime, let's say, we don't see much. Why don't we see evolution happening fast? Again, what is the stimulus for evolution? Environmental change in the environment, right? A drastic change in the, as long as the climate stays the same, as long as the abiotic factors stay more or less the same, stable, there's no, why should I invest in changing? There's no stimulus for changing. In other words, the mutations are happening at random all the time, but that mutation may not have an advantage. So it may be a neutral mutation, all right? Or it may actually be a deleterious, a negative mutation. Most mutations are actually neutral. They don't do anything. And so that mutation dies with the organism that gathered it, okay? Every now and then there's a mutation that is actually positive, But if it's not tested by a drastic change in the environment, then that mutation goes wasted, if you will, was not used. Okay? And so it really is a combination of the changing of the environment with the chance occurrence of a mutation that may be beneficial for that particular climatological or environmental change. But if there's no change, if the environment stays more or less the same, then we expect very little or no change. We just have the variation that is a standard normal variation of every species as it's reproducing. Okay, so now we're going to take a little break, and then when we come back, we're going to look finally at selection. Okay, any questions or comments from this? The take-home message with regards to adaptedness, right? Meyer makes the point that it is kind of an opportunistic thing. We look at nature and we see that at first sight they seem perfectly adapted, but actually they're just best adapted to the particular climate or the particular environmental factors they are. And as long as the environment stays stable, we'll see little or no change in those species. But if there's a drastic change, or even if there's a gradual change, then the species that don't adapt will not survive. Okay, let's break here then. I'll pause and resume. Okay, resuming recording then, we're going to go into the second half, which is finally going to be on selection. As I've mentioned before, is the fourth force that drives evolution, but really the one that effectively causes evolution. The other three are possibilities. And again, keep in mind that evolution is always done is in a probabilistic realm, right? There is the chance, the possibility, the probability of, but it's always a statistical model. Mm-hmm. Whereas actual ecosystems and the environment, as we look out the window, is not probabilistic, it's deterministic. What do I mean by that? It's important to be clear on these concepts. The distinction between probabilistic model and deterministic model. In other words, when I look out of the window, I don't see probabilities or possibilities. I see realities. I see objective realities that are there, whether I'm looking out the window or not. It's not that the forest goes away when I stop looking out the window, right? It goes away for me. But objectively, the forest, we assume that it continues there, because when I look out the window again, it's back there, okay? So objectively, it's there. In other words, it is determined. It is objectively real out there, whether I observe it or not. And so that's what we mean by a deterministic model. And we have a parallel to that in the practice of medicine, all right? The practice of medicine is a probabilistic science or a probabilistic art, the practice of medicine. Doctor, I hurt here, do some tests, okay, they discover I have something, they give me a pill, they give me a procedure, and the doctor will say, what are the chances of my recovering or surviving or getting better or whatnot? And the doctor will say, well, the chances are, there's a 90% chance if you take this pill, you go through this procedure, chances are that you'll make it, that you will heal, okay? But that's based on the probability. And what is that chances are based on? Well, in the past, 90% of 100 people who took this pill and had your same disease, 90 of those 100 got well, all right? So it's based on past experience, and that develops a statistical model, which is projected forward. And so it's always statistical, but until we heal, and if we heal, we won't know deterministically. So we, again, as we go to the doctor or whatever, we're not probabilities. We're actual, real, life, deterministic individuals. And so when we talk about evolution, because it has happened already, it's a probabilistic model. Whenever we talk about evolution, we have to say chances are, we have to frame it in, on average, likely, chances are, most likely, All right, we always have to frame it in that sense, because really what we're looking at, we're not actually looking at evolution, we're looking at the effect of evolution, which is the living world that surrounds us, including ourselves. Okay, so of all those four factors, the one that actually makes evolution happen, if you will, is this one about selection. And it is a selecting out process. In other words, it's a process of elimination. On average, the weaker will not survive, on average. What does that mean? That we go deterministically, every now and then we find weaker organisms in nature. What does that mean? That they survive. Okay, so it's on average. But for each individual, some are stronger, some are weaker. On average, the weaker will not survive. Okay, in order to understand selection a little better, we can look first at artificial selection, which is what humanity has been doing for centuries, for millennia. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, but most of the time it's been on purpose. And well, there are three types of selection. We can look at artificial selection, which is done by humans. Then natural selection that occurs in the environment that assumes random mating, all right? And then sexual selection, which is non-random mating by definition, is mate choice. Let's look at artificial selection. Another word for artificial selection has been breeding or animal husbandry or agriculture. Let's start, for example, with the apple. The wild crab apple, the original apples were small, and they are descendants of what is known today as the crab apple, all right, which is like a wild apple. It is tiny, like that, more the size of a cherry. That is the natural fruit of the apple tree before we humans started doing selection on the apple. And so when we start doing selection on the apple, we are favoring a particular characteristic. In this case, what is the selection? What are we selecting on?
Size.
Exactly. Simply size. All right. So let's say we have a crabapple tree in front of us. It's going to have all the little crab apples hanging from it. Because this is a quantitative trait, all right, then what are we going to find between the individual? Let's say there are 10 little apples, 10 little crab apples on the tree. Do you expect all of those 10 little crab apples to be exactly the same size? No, it's going to be a range. Naturally, it's going to be a range. And what kind of a distribution will we expect on average in nature? It's going to be a normal distribution, right? So most of the crab apples will be about the same size, and a few will be larger and a few will be smaller. So on average, statistically speaking, we're going to get a normal distribution of crab apples of every tree, all right? If we're selecting for size, what are we going to do? What's the natural intuition to do? What seeds are we going to plant? From the smallest crab apple or from the largest fruit? We're going to take the largest fruit and plant those seeds, right? Yeah. But we're selecting on the large end of the scale. We're not selecting on the norm. We're away from the norm. We're selecting on the large size, all right, on the extreme. When we plant those seeds from the larger crabapple, and the tree comes up, and we wait a few years, whatever it takes. Now we get another 10 little fruits, apple fruits on this crabapple tree. What do we expect the norm of those crab apples to be, of the size? The intuition is that the norm for those crab apples is going to have shifted from the parent norm, and it's going to shift to the small size or to the large size.
Large.
It's going to shift to the large, so that now the large size of the parent tree is going to be the norm of the F1 generation of the offspring. All right, that's going to be the new norm. So then we can select again on large of that one. And we keep selecting larger and larger, and we're shifting that size of the average crabapple at every generation. We do that enough hundreds of generations, and eventually we get a large apple from the original little crabapple. okay? And that's called artificial selection. We're doing the selection and we're accelerating the process because we are selecting on purpose the particular characteristic that we're interested in this case, size. And typically it's size, all right?
So far, how about the flavor? Because
Yes.
we have different species now.
Yes.
Which all originated from the wild crab.
Yes.
But now we have different species, and they are also different textures.
Right.
And within the species, and they
Yes.
also have different flavors as well.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
how do you?
Exactly. You can, so all of those size, flavor, texture, color, what are all those that I've mentioned? Are those genotypes or they're phenotypes? They're expressions of the genotype, right?
Yeah.
So they're morphological or there could be physiological as far as taste, all right? So you can select on any one of those or any combinations of those, depending on what's on the market or what to do with the market. You want to generate an apple that has a new taste, you select on that, okay? So, but the norm here, the implication behind all this is variety, that there is variety. And so you spoke of species, but perhaps it's a little better to speak about variants, varieties, because I cannot tell you really if the apples are a different species or the different varieties of the same species. You see the difference?
Yes.
Okay, and I really don't know. I confess my ignorance on that. I don't know. You know, someone in agriculture would know. But it could be that they all originate from the original crabapple, and they're still the same species, but they're just varieties, just like dogs. Dogs look so different, different breeds look so different from each other. You think they're different species, but they're not. They're the same species. They're just varieties. So really, variety can be very varied. Can be very narrow or can be extremely varied. Mm-hmm. And that's what selection is selecting on the variety, the particular variety. So that's just an example of what we mean by artificial selection. Another one, which is a classic, in fact, this inspired Darwin to think about his theory, is wild mustard. It's a little plant that some people would consider a weed that grows along the edge of roads and cracks and sidewalks, etc. It's a little weed that has a yellowish flower, small, okay? But guess what? From the wild mustard come 5 varieties of vegetables today, including the broccoli, okay? The cauliflower, the cabbage, kale, and this other thing called kohlrabi, which are different parts of the plant that have been selected for. The trunk, the stem, the flower, okay? So different parts of the mustard plant that have been selected on have actually produced this variety of very different vegetables, but they all come from the same original wildflower, wild mustard. And this is already known in Darwin's time, because selection had been going on for millennia, really. There's an anecdote that it was horrible to go to dine out with Darwin because instead of eating the food, he would start picking at the food and see where it came from, and he would get into the other guy's dish and see where the different varieties of food came from, mostly vegetables, okay? And he was a mess. He wouldn't actually eat the food, he would play with it. But it is said that this gave him the idea that this actually, when we do artificial selection, we're mimicking what nature is doing over a longer, much longer period of time and a random fashion. It happens with animals, for example. These are all lovebirds, okay, of the same species, but look at the great variety. What's the selection here? What is the selecting factor? The color, the pattern, the color pattern, all right? They're all the same size, they all interbreed and so forth, but it's the color. I don't know actually if they interbreed or not, but they're all the same species. They're just different varieties of color pattern. And all this is done in breeding artificially. Also in what is known as animal husbandry, which is animals that are used in the farming industry and in farmland, all right? Again, the wild chicken was a little bird like that, and now we have these huge chickens that look almost like little turkeys. And the wild turkey was also a little guy. I don't know if you've seen wild turkeys. I've seen wild turkeys up north in New York State, and they're small and not as plump as fat as the ones that have been selected. Featherless chickens, okay? They just selected on the genes or the set of genes that make feathers because it's much easier for the industry to process that chicken to clean, all right? But everything comes at a disadvantage. What's the disadvantage here? This chicken, right, cannot stay warm by itself, definitely needs warmth and no exposure to sunlight because of UV, all right, there's no protection. So they have to be kept in a controlled environment. But the industry figured that it was cheaper to do this mutation and keep them in that controlled environment than to leave the feathers on. Okay, so typical artificial selection in plants is done by cross-pollination on the selected species that, on the selected characteristic that is of interest. And with animals is done by artificial insemination, mostly in farm animals, but also in the pet industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, all right? Now, let's look at 5 observations that led Darwin and others to consider, to infer the possibility of selection, that nature is actually, that there's selection going on in nature, all right, and therefore natural selection. The first observation is that there is a high fertility rate in nature. There's an overabundance of gametes, of zygotes, of early embryos. There's a huge overabundance in the order of magnitude, 3 and 4 orders of magnitude, just to replace, how many zygotes are necessary to replace the parents? 2. 2 zygotes replace the 2 parents, right? But many of these species have hundreds and thousands of eggs, and sometimes even in the millions of either gametes or the fertilized eggs. So why that overabundance? You would think that there's a waste there, and there is. At the level of individual species, there's definitely huge waste. Another one is that, on the other hand, when we look at populations in nature of whatever species, they tend to be stable, all right? Unless there's a drastic change in the environment. But if there's no drastic change, if the environment is stable, the population is also stable. In other words, if there are 10 mice that are living around this building on campus, and we come back a year from now, if the weather has stayed about the same, the expectation is that we still find 10 mice. Then maybe the progeny of the mice from last year, but it's still 10 on average, all right? So the populations in nature are stable. Another one is that resources are always limited. There's no way to feed all of these overabundance of progeny. And that's why, so therefore populations are going to go into a pattern, a growth pattern that eventually stabilizes. And we'll get into it further down, but it's called the sigmoid curve or population growth curve. It's like a stretched out S. It starts slowly, goes very fast, and then it slows down again and stabilizes because the natural resources are limited. Then also the variety that we observe in nature. Any population that we look at, which by definition is representing a single species, any population, we're going to see a range of variety. If we gather the 10 mice that live around this building, all right, we're going to see a variety. They all belong to the same species, Mus musculus, but there's going to be some that are a little smaller and some that are a little larger, maybe a small range, but there will be a range. There'll be a range of size, there'll be a range of color, there'll be a range of behaviors, and so forth. And finally, that we see that these variations are inheritable. So that on average, if the larger mice mate, they will tend to produce larger mice. All right, so the variation that we see tend to be inheritable. Okay, this is the overview. Let's look at them in a little detail just to see some examples of the overabundance of gametes or zygotes that are produced, or early embryos that are produced in nature. It happens in animals. For example, here's a female crab with a pouch of, of eggs, of rows. It's called a row, all right? There must be literally thousands of eggs here. These are all fertilized eggs, but it only takes one of these to replace that one female crab, okay? And she's carrying thousands of these tiny little embryos. This other example here, these are embryonic frog eggs or salamander, all right? Again, hundreds of them in a clutch, whereas it only takes two to replace the two parents. In the plant world, for sure, it happens. For example, overabundance of gametes. These are pine trees. You see this yellow cloud? You know what that yellow cloud is? That's pollen. That's pollen. That's the equivalent of semen for animals, okay? Pollen grains, each pollen grain, in fact, contains 2 sperm cells inside, 2 sperm nuclei. And this is a macro photograph of pollen. You can see the large variety in color, shape of pollen grains. But these are pine trees putting out pollen. The huge amounts of pollen.
When you look at those crab eggs, right?
Yes.
How many, on an average, how many of those are actually?
Several thousand. That's what we call egg roll.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
And it happens with crustaceans.
Yeah.
Sorry?
How many of those crab eggs become?
On average, how many of these make it to survival?
Yeah.
On average?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
2. Because this is a female, so those 2 are the ones that are going to replace the female and the male. So 1 of each. On average, only 1 male and 1 female will make it. Assuming that this is a stable population, that's what I mean by a stable population.
Right.
So 99.999% of these are wasted as far as the species is concerned, all right? There's an overabundance. But what do they become in fact in nature? All these eggs, what do they become? Food for many other animals. So they're food, okay? But for that species, it's an overabundance.
How many total? 2. No, 2. How many?
2 to replace for the stable population.
Out of how many eggs?
Several thousand. I don't know how many, but I'll say several thousand. So it's like 3 or 4 orders of magnitude. It's just incredible, the overabundance. And look at the pollen. You know, these are macroscopic pollen grains, okay? You know how many millions of pollen grains have to be here to see a cloud of it? There are literally millions, if not billions of pollen grains. That's a 9th order of magnitude. That's 10 to the 9. And to replace this one pine tree that is producing this pollen cloud, how many of those pollen are needed? One pollen grain to fertilize 1 egg of this pine tree to replace it, okay? So talk about overabundance. It's exotic, it's exuberant, it's bewildering. Why this overabundance? Considering that sexual reproduction actually takes twice the energy as asexual reproduction. You know, it would seem such a waste. You would think that everything is running out of energy just in reproduction. So there's an overabundance. Okay, here, all these clumps of little seedlings, right, are sprouting, whereas it only takes 1 of these seedlings to make it to adulthood to replace the parent cell, the parent plant that produced them. In the fungi, also, all right, look at this cloud of spores. These are called puffballs. These are puffball mushrooms. They're pretty large, and at some point when they're fully mature, they explode. All the spores are released. This is a tiny little photomicrograph here of the spores. in the micrometer scale. But again, these are billions or trillions of little spores, each one of them capable of generating a new puffball, a new mushroom. And here again, we see a whole cluster of umbrella mushrooms, whereas it only takes one to replace the parents. Okay. So by conclusion, the vast majority of gametes don't fertilize, and the vast majority of zygotes and embryos don't survive. They certainly don't survive to reproductive adulthood. Then another observation is that populations tend to be stable. And that's what I mean by a sigmoid curve. You see, it's like an S stretched out. Population starts here with 2 parents having progeny. And generally, on average, it's a geometric progression. All right? The population would double at every generation. You start with the parental generation, then F1, F2, F3, the filial generations, right? So they double. So at first, the growth curve, this is known as a growth curve, is slow, and it's called the lag phase. This is called the lag phase, all right, because it's lagging, it's going slowly. But then at some point, because it is a geometric progression, it is a doubling, what happens, it goes into an exponential growth curve because it's doubling the population at every generation. And so it goes into what is known as a log phase, L-O-G. A log phase is exponential, and it climbs very fast. In a relatively short period of time, the population doubles and doubles and doubles, increase in size. But eventually, all natural populations flatten out. They flatten out, okay? And why do they flatten out? When they flatten out, it means that the same number of individuals is dying that is being born or is coming into the population, okay? So there's a turnover. Individuals are dying at the same rate that they are surviving. And so the population flattens out. When it flattens out, that is called the carrying capacity, illustrated by a capital K, right? Represented by capital K. It's called the carrying capacity. Every population in nature, every species in nature has a carrying capacity that is dependent mostly on what? On the resources that are available. So for plants, it's going to be, what are the 2 main resources for plants that are obvious and they come from the atmosphere? The 2 main resources for plants: light and water, rain, okay? So sunlight and rain. But also one that is hidden that we don't see, but is very important and needed is the nutrients, the nitrates and the phosphates, the nutrients from the soil. So it's really 3 abiotic factors. Those are all in limited condition. There's not an overabundance of rain. There's not an unlimited amount of rain. There's not a limited amount of sunlight. For example, at night, there's no sunlight, okay? And there's a limited amount of minerals also in every soil. Some soils are richer and some soils are more poor, but there's always limited amount of abiotic factors. So that establishes the carrying capacity of each population in nature. Except for, there's only one species that we have not been able to figure out what is the carrying capacity of that one species. And that species is all over the world, and that's the human. We are in the log phase right now, okay? In the environmental course, we'll get more into that and see a human population growth curve, but it's just basically vertical right now. So we're into that log phase, and we don't know if and when it's going to stabilize, you know, and what's going to stabilize it. Because precisely of our artificial selection, of our technology, we have extended our environment. We have been able to live even in no environments. In space, there's the International Space Station floating around for years now, okay? And that's essentially space, right? So there's no environment there in principle. And we have managed to live there too. So we are a very unique, interesting species that has managed to make a secret out of our carrying capacity. We don't know, okay? Because it's extremely complex. We just don't know what is the carrying capacity of Earth for the human species. But we can figure out every other one. Here, for example, is a crab catching and caught, and is eating a baby turtle. And you would think that in principle, what a shame. What a pity that this baby turtle got eaten by a crab, by a lolly crab. However, why did this turtle get caught by the crab? Because there are dozens of turtles, enough hundreds of turtles that come out from a single clutch of eggs. Let's say that there are dozens of them, 40, 30, 40 turtles that come out. Maybe I've ever seen that site. It's fantastic. Yeah, they head out to the shore. I once saw it years ago. So why did this turtle get caught by the crab?
Slow.
It was probably the slowest turtle, right? Probably the slowest turtle, which makes it the weakest turtle. If this weakest turtle gets to make it to adulthood and fertilizes, either it's a female or a male, that weakness gets passed on, and it debilitates the race instead of making it stronger. And so this is natural selection acting there. This turtle was selected out by the crab. Not that the crab was looking for the weakest turtle. The crab was just looking for a turtle. Okay? And on average, it's going to be, it could be that the crab could catch the strongest turtle, because the strongest turtle just, yeah, it's at random. Maybe the strongest turtle tripped for going too fast, and the crab caught it, you know? So you see the chance involved in this. But and that's why we speak on average, it will be the fastest turtle that will make it to the waterline that will survive, on average. Here, drastic example, these are chimpanzees. You know, chimpanzees are actually very aggressive, all right? And this is an alpha male using a stick to beat another male, to beat out another male. So this is a weapon. Chimpanzees using a weapon, all right, to establish his dominance, his alpha. Really drastic. Okay. Resources are limited. Here's a moose, happens to be a female moose, has no rack, chewing on twigs that are left in the wintertime. These trees are not dead, they're dormant, right? But in the wintertime, they have basically lost their leaves. That's why they are deciduous, they drop their leaves. And so this moose is scrounging around, trying to find whatever twigs she can find to survive through the winter. But they're going to be limited resources. As soon as this moose goes through this strand of trees, the next moose coming along is not going to find, it's going to find fewer twigs to chew on, and so on and so forth. Okay? Here, this happens with plants also. Here's a river. It's an old river. How do you know it's an old river? Has a lot of bends and curves. A new river would be more straight, right? But an old river keeps, as the water flows, let's say it's flowing this way. As the water flows, it would tend to continue to erode on this side, on this bank, and deposit on this bank. And so as the river grows, it tends to meander more and more, become more S-shaped. So very S-shaped rivers are older rivers. In fact, in some drastic examples, this eventually starts carving in here and will cut out and would form an island. So a river with islands is an even older river. Mm-hmm. At any rate, what you see, this river is going through a very desertic territory, and so the vegetation is restricted to the water source, to the river bank. And you can see it's very clearly restricted to the river bank because that's the only water source available, certainly for large trees. Okay, and the rest of the terrain is too dry, so limited resources. Here, another drastic example. Here is a plastic bottle that has obviously been floating on the ocean for some time. How do we know that this plastic bottle has been floating on the surface? And this part of the, I can tell you unequivocally that this part of the bottle was floating, was the top of the bottle, was the dry part. And this part of the bottle, of the plastic bottle, was immersed under the surface because of the cluster of barnacles, right? Barnacle larvae are free swimming, therefore part of the plankton, but they found a foothold where they could actually grab and establish, and they established a whole colony on this artificial bottle floating around. But what was very scarce in the middle of the ocean for the larvae of these barnacles? The scarcity was a foothold, something to grab on to grow, because the adult stage is sedentary, is sessile, is grounded, is not free swimming. Okay? Another example, some vultures fighting over a carcass. The carcass is a limited resource. So on average, the strongest vulture is the one that will get the better share of that carcass, on average. Limited resources all over the place. So there is selection pressure, right? All right. Variety, we've talked about this many times. These are patterns of giraffes. And you can see there's a great variety of patterns of giraffes, all the same species. Great pattern variety of giraffes. We talked about the phases of human, which could be selecting, conscious or subconscious. Some people will like curly hair. Most people will not like bald hair, okay, bald heads. Some like straight hair, some like curly hair, etc. But there's conscious and subconscious selecting going on the human face. These are all snails of the same species. Look at the variety of patterns. Same species of snails, great variety. Here is an orchid that has 3 varieties of color pattern. All right, maybe different bees, different insects zoom in on particular variety. And that's just what we see with the naked eye. There are also patterns in the infrared that we don't see with the naked eye. Here's an example. These are lilies, all right, which we see yellow, but on the infrared scale, look at the pattern, drastically different from what we see. So there are also patterns, and some insects can see in the infrared range that we don't see. So some insects are seeing this pattern of white and orange as opposed to yellow, solid yellow that we see. So there's variety, seen and unseen, all over the place for every species. And many of these variations are, of course, inheritable. There's perfect example are the cichlids. I don't know if you know about cichlids, but cichlids are very precious fish for the fish industry, for pets, right? Freshwater. Many of them come from lakes in Africa, in East Africa, Lake Victoria and Lake Turkana and so forth, which are tributaries. But there's a tremendous variety of cichlids. It's estimated to be about 400 species of cichlids. The interesting thing is that, and they all live in these lakes, mostly Lake Victoria. But Lake Victoria was bone dry 17,000 years ago, meaning no fish, okay? And it went on for about 3,000 years, was bone dry, and finally was refilled about 14,000 years ago. That tells you that there was drastic climate change here, which we did not cause, by the way. That happened naturally because of wind patterns and so forth. But that Lake Victoria was bone dry for 3,000 years, fairly recently. In 14,000 years, 400 species of cichlids have developed. So talk about variety and inheritance of variety. It has to do a lot with the particular nature, the habitat, the region, the local region of the lake where the fish inhabits. And the selective pressure, which is also going to be not only natural selection, but also a sexual selection, all right? Especially of the female on the male. So that is a strong pressure that we'll see in a few minutes. Okay, John?
What are theories on how the fish actually get there if it was bone dry for 3,000 years?
Good question. Probably tributaries that, because Lake Victoria is also kind of halfway in a range of, in a topography that is fed by rivers. All right. So these are ancestors of the cichlids, must have come from the tributary rivers into Lake Victoria. All right. And then speciated in there. They found a new environment in the lake, something they didn't have in the river. This little diagram here, the phylogenetic tree here, is pointing out the inheritance of the variety and the divergence of species from common ancestors. Okay, let's consider the niche, because I've been talking about niche and habitat, but haven't really defined it yet. Is the role that an organism plays in a particular geographic locality in a local region. The role of the organism in a local region, that's the niche. So it's a combination. It has the organism, the behavior of the organism, and also the locality, the geography, the local geography, okay? So, yeah, excuse me for a moment. Let me pause for a moment here. Okay, so we're talking about niche, and it's a combination of the animal with the behavior of the animal, or the organism, because there's also plants, of course, and fungi, all organisms, in a particular locality, all right? So, for example, this is a niche here, and it's actually a residence, it's a habitat for several different species. First of all, we see the carcass of a zebra, may have been brought down by the tiger. So here's a tigress, all right, and her role is as a predator of the zebra. On average, this would have been the weaker zebra of that group. But also you see some other animals here that are predators. There's in the background here a hyena that is waiting her turn because she cannot compete with the lioness, all right? So she's waiting her turn to get a piece of whatever is left of the carcass. And then even after that, there are these 3 vultures that are literally hovering around waiting for their turn too. So they have a niche to play also here in the eating up of that carcass. But also, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 animals here, dead or alive, don't live in the abstract. They're living within a particular patch of grass that also the grass has its own niche, which is in this area, whether there are predators or animals on it or not. In fact, of all these animals, which would be the one influencing the grass the most? The zebra is the only herbivore, right? The others are carnivores. So once the zebra is gone, the gone zebra is a good thing for the grass. All right. Okay. These niches happen at a large macroscopic scale that we can see, but they also happen at a small scale. All right. They can either be continuous or discontinuous. This is an example of a continuous niche here. You have to think about it a little bit. These little creatures are aphids. They're insects, and they are nasty because they suck out the sap from the plant, from twigs, all right? So here's a twig that is infested with aphids, and here's another twig that is infested with aphids. So at the local level, because these are 2 separate twigs and aphids move relatively slowly, this is a population of aphids, and this is another population of aphids, even though they most likely belong to the same species, all right? But this twig has its own population, this twig has its other population of the same species. There's going to be some flow. It's expected that some of these individuals will migrate to this twig and vice versa periodically, all right? What do we call that as far as the forces? Gene flow, exactly. So there's going to be flow between the genetic pool of this population and this population. It will be small, but it is significant, all right? So there's a continuous gene flow here between populations of with niches of the aphid. This continues is some distance between the niches or the habitats. That distance could be a small distance or it could be a large distance. For example, if it's small, all right, it's an example of lichens. What are lichens? See these boulders here? All right, these boulders have been rounded up. Probably this is from a dried out riverbed because they're eroded, okay? But they have these patches of tan color growing on them. These patches are called lichens, and lichen is a symbiosis between algae and fungi, okay? What do the algae provide? The algae are producers, they photosynthesize, so they provide food. The fungi provide a moist environment in which to live, because the algae they need liquid to live in. So the fungi provide a moist environment in which the algae can grow and live. What do the fungi do to the rock? Fungi, remember, they're pioneer species. They begin a succession series, all right? And it turns out that lichens, the fungi, pour out acid, a little bit of acid. And what does the acid do to the rock? It erodes the rock over a long period of time. This is very slowly, but lichens actually erode rock into minerals, into soil, which can then be, other plants can eventually come into the area and start establishing and contribute to the formation of soil, okay? But here's an example of patchy or discontinuous niche and habitat, the lichens, that is at a small scale. Within each rock has its own community of lichens, all right, each particular rock. Another example would be a large geographical barrier between two continents. These are monkeys, spider monkeys in South America and in Africa. So they are divided by an entire ocean. And so this is a discontinuous niche or habitat by these tree monkeys, arboreal monkeys. Let's skip one. Oh, yeah. All right, I mentioned that selection is an elimination process, okay? It's an elimination. So we have several eliminations going on here. On average, which salmon is going to make it through this waterfall? On average, the strongest, fastest salmon will make it. The weaker salmon will tend to get caught by the grizzly. All right, so there's selective pressure on that salmon by the grizzly. However, so that's the interspecies selection, all right? But there's also intraspecies selection going on here. Who can tell me a type of intraspecies selection that is fairly obvious from this photograph? How many grizzlies are there? 3. Are the 3 hunting at the same rate? No, right? This one seems to be the strongest one, can actually get a foothold right at the edge. So this one on average is the one catching the salmon. This poor fellow back here is not catching much salmon. So there's selection, there's intraspecies selection going on also. There's competition, okay? And so on average, the most fit will select out the less fit from its own species or from another species. All right, we can look at selection by looking at the zygote and determining it's a 2-step process, either pre-zygotic selection or post-zygotic selection, all right? The post-zygotic selection is on the individual who is developing, but the pre-zygotic selection is on the gametes before the individual. So let's look at that just briefly. Here we have meiosis, which is the process of forming gametes. So this is gametogenesis. Gametogenesis, right, will form either oogenesis in the ovaries to produce, on average, 1 fertile egg, or spermatogenesis in the testicles, as we saw, to produce many fertile sperm. Again, here is the overabundance, all right, the millions of sperm contrasted to the 1 egg. Now, fertilization occurs, and this whole process, from the process of meiosis, of the gametogenesis, to the actual maturation of the gametes, whether they are eggs or sperm, selection can happen. Selection can happen here. There could be damage at any stage. It could be a biochemical damage. It could be a physiological damage, all right? Then the process of fertilization itself, the selective pressure there is intense. On average, the vast majority of these sperm will not fertilize that egg, okay? on average, only the strongest one, most capacitated, and so forth. So there's an intense selection pressure leading up to the actual fertilization process. Once we have fertilization, then we have the zygote of whatever species, not only human, but remember, all animals, all plants that reproduce sexually begin with that zygote, with that fertilized egg. So you can see there are many different types of selection, of natural selection that could happen pre-zygotic up to the moment of fertilization. Those are generally all microscopic, okay? But then from the zygote forward, that's why I have it down here, then we have the embryonic stages, embryonic development, the embryo, the fetus, etc. That fetus has to be born successfully and develop for, in the case of human, for at least a couple of decades on average to adulthood, and then be able to find a mate who is also fertile and procreate an offspring who is also fertile. That's what we call reproductive success. Okay, so we won't really be able to tell until the third generation, until the offspring actually grows up to adulthood and is capable of procreating, because otherwise, how do we know that the offspring, we don't know if a baby is fertile or not, experimentally, you know, empirically. And so that's why I have 3 generations here, all right? If these are the children of these grandparents, and these are the children of these children, of the grandchildren of the grandparents, then we have the 3 generations, and this is the proof of principle that this particular couple achieved reproductive success. But imagine all the obstacles that can happen, not only in the human, but in any species along the way. There's selective pressure always against, all right, against the weaker ones on average that will be selected out. And so this process starts at the microscopic level, but pretty soon goes into the macroscopic level for each individual species. Let me see. So we can divide then selective pressure, natural selection, on two steps, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic, using as the zygote as the beginning of the new individual of whatever species as a watershed or establishing a boundary. There are different types of selective pressures that occur pre-zygotic, mainly on the gametes, than on post-zygotic, all right? For example, give you an example. If mutations occur, if UV mutation occurs or chemical mutations occurs pre-zygotic, it's going to affect that whole generation afterwards, or it may. But if mutations occur post-zygotic on the individual, it may just affect that one individual, not be passed on. You know, that individual will not achieve maybe reproductive success, but that's the end of that mutation, you think? So different types of selective pressures, whether it's pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. Okay, let me stop here for a moment, pause. The competitive exclusion principle is very important, all right? It's a fundamental principle, and it goes this way. Basically, that no 2 different species will inhabit the same niche at the same time, because they cannot exploit the same resources. Sooner or later, one species will displace the other species. And that's the competitive exclusion. They will compete. If they're competing for the same resources, one species that may have some slight advantage will displace the other species. All right, so we're talking about 2 populations. Let's look at it. Just very simply, here is a little caricature, the diagram of these yellow birds are initially living and feeding happily on these little black bugs on this one tree, okay? So that's their niche. Their niche is to feed on these little black bugs all along the tree, on the canopy on the tree and the trunk of the tree. Wherever there's a black bug, they don't care, they just eat them. All right, now along come these red birds. It's another species of the same group of animals, They're birds, but they're red instead of yellow, in other words, representing a different species. But guess what? They eat the same bugs, okay? They eat the same bugs. So at some point, these two populations of red and yellow birds will have to work it out. If they want to stay in the same tree, they have to relocate either to the canopy or the trunk to a particular habitat, all right, where they will be happy eating those bugs because it's the same bug. Or if the yellow species is stronger than the red species, what happens? The red species will not get a foothold on this tree. They will be displaced. Or vice versa, if the red species, the incoming species, is stronger, or is more fit, actually I should say is more fit for black bugs than the yellow species, eventually the red species will displace totally the yellow one, all right? And that's the competitive exclusion principle. It's applied all over nature, and it occurs not only in animals, it occurs in plants also. Plants also exclude each other competitively. Typically it takes a little longer, but they do. Fungi for sure, the protists, and also bacteria and archaea. In other words, all living organisms will tend to exclude each other if they're competing for the same resources, Oops. Now, another question is, what does selection act upon? What is natural selection acting? What is being selected? What is nature selecting? You know, because there's no mind, there's no ethereal mind out there on nature that is, okay, I'm going to select this bird now, and I'm going to select this butterfly and this flower. No, there's no ethereal mind that is directing selection, right? So what is selection acting upon? It is acting first on the genotype of each individual organism. The genotype of each individual organism. At what level? At the 4 levels. What are the 4 levels? The morphological, the physiological, the behavioral, and the biochemical or molecular. Okay? At those 4 levels, selection is acting, but this is the phenotype. The genotype is impervious. The genotype is isolated from selection. All right? The genotype gets transmitted, gets passed on. It's the phenotype that is being selected on. So, for example, as the object of selection, the phenotype is both evolutionarily stable and evolvable. What do we mean by that? There's a stability. Nature, we say that nature is economic. In other words, when nature comes up with something that works, it tends to keep it. It tends to hang around. Like, for example, legs, articulated legs for walking. It solves the problem of getting around. There's no need to invent another mechanism, okay? And that, for example, is a great example, is the nucleus of eukaryotes. All eukaryotes, right, by definition, they have nuclei, but this is the universal way of storing DNA in a cell and keeping it away from nucleases and other enzymes that can digest the DNA, can damage the DNA. It's packaged, compacted into the nucleus. So whether they are proteins, for example, here's an amoeba, protozoan, or algae, they all have a nucleus. The fungi, they also have nuclei. These hyphae, these little cells, individual cells. This is a macroscopic fungus. This is a sporangium here. They all have nuclei. Plant cells, this is the epidermis of a plant leaf. You can see the nucleus of each individual cell. This is a human tissue, a cross-section of epidermis. Here's the dead skin. This is the epidermal layer. This is the dermal layer. All of the cells, the nucleus is stained in purple, all right? All of the living cells, they have their nucleus across the board. So we can say that the nucleus is a universal solution, if you will, for encasing the DNA and protecting the DNA in nature. It worked when it was first selected, and it stayed. and so it is stable across all living organisms that have a nucleus. At the same time, the phenotype is dynamic. Its plastic is evolvable. In other words, it can change precisely because of the variation. So here are 3 examples of locomotion, and the phenotypes are very different from each other, but they have the same function. So again, these are analogous structures, okay? For example, clams and bivalves, animals that have 2 shells, they typically have a muscular foot that sticks out and allows the animal to move around and also to dig into the sand, especially if the sand is soft, all right? So they have a muscular foot. Whereas echinoderms, this is the leg of a starfish. They have this little tube feet that form inside a whole system. It's called a water vascular system. It's a hydraulic system of little feet that move the echinoderm, starfish, sea urchins also. They move by these little feet that have a suction cup at the base. It has a very different origin than a muscular foot, but it has the same purpose, to move the animal around. In arthropods, for example, the articulated legs that I talked about, the appendages, they're all articulated, very much articulated, that allow the animal to move around, okay? So we see that different types of legs have evolved independently according to that particular niche or habitat that is functional for that particular animal.
I have a quick question. So, as the object of selection, phenotype is both
Evolvable and stable.
What about like in bacteria? Is that's true as well?
Yes, actually I have bacteria as an example later on as a kind of a definitive proof that evolution is happening all the time. So let me hold that till I get to it, because you'll see what I mean. The secondary object of selection is the gametes, as I spoke, especially in prezygotic, right? In prezygotic selection is definitely the gametes. And also, then we go into groups. Secondarily, the group is also under selective pressure, natural selection. So it could be group selection. Sometimes an entire population gets wiped out, or very few individuals from that population survive a cataclysmic event, like it could be a erupted volcano or a drastic climatological change, something like that. Kin selection also happens between siblings, all right? There's competition between siblings, typically for mating. So that would be sexual selection, but it could also be for food resources, which is non-sexual. Then it would be natural selection. So when it happens within a family or within a tribe or a clan, then that's kin selection. When it happens in between species, like the example I gave between the salmon and the bear, the grizzly bear, then that's interspecies. And that's one of the reasons why introduced or invasive species are so dangerous. Because typically when they're introduced into a new region, there are no natural predators exactly for that species. And so they tend to take over a region and they become what is known as a monoculture. This happens a lot in plants, but it can also happen in animals, right? So we have to be very careful with exotic or invasive species because they are missing that interspecies selection being in a new environment. Finally, at the level of the clade or a large group can be selected out by a drastic environmental change, typically, like the case of the dinosaurs. So that's secondarily, okay? It's the object of selection, but it also happens for sure. Why is evolution so slow? Well, again, when we look around, we see that most organisms are adapted to the environment in which they live, as long as there is no drastic change. But when there is change, certainly we will see, on average, we will see evolution kicking in. And that's the example precisely of the superbugs that I wanted to give with your question about bacteria. So what are the superbugs? These are bacteria.
Antibiotic resistant.
Exactly. They are immune to a range of antibiotics. So typically we use antibiotics, talk about artificial selection, right? Scientists have figured out that using antibiotics kills bacteria. And so it's a great antiseptic and it's a great medication for healing bacterial infections. But now a number of bacteria are becoming immune to those antibiotics. What does that mean? Well, that means that those bacteria have developed by chance mutation, they have developed resistance to the antibiotic, which typically could be a protein or a carbohydrate, all right? And they have developed somehow a resistance, a way of blocking out that poison to them. Because in every bacterial culture, we get billions and billions of bacteria at the next generation, okay? Is that exponential growth. And on average, some of those will have mutations, natural mutations that occur. Then those bacteria survive this particular antibiotic. What does the researcher have to do, the pharmaceutical company? They have to go back into the lab and develop another antibiotic, different one. Well, over time, by using that new antibiotic, this bacteria also become resistant to the other antibiotic. And so you get into a vicious circle like that of generating more and more antibiotics that are specific, and the bacteria becoming more and more immune to them, to the point where you get these superbugs, okay? These bacteria that are immune to practically any antibiotic that is known, and it takes a while to develop an antibiotic. Then the perfect storm, in a negative sense, is when these bacteria lodge in places, institutions that are in charge of curing people, like hospitals and clinics, and they lodge, let's say, in the air system, in the vent system of hospitals, all right? And I think Legionnaire's disease was an example of that. The outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that was many years ago in a particular locality. But that is a horrible situation when these superbugs are lodged in the vent system of hospitals that are taking care of sometimes hundreds of patients at a time, including the surgical theaters. So that's in general why patients are moved fast out of the hospital today. They're moved fast quickly because there's a danger, increasing danger of the superbugs lurking around in some of these rooms in the hospital and so forth. Okay, there's only so much that can be cleansed and sterilized. So this is a drastic example of evolution occurring even in a short period of time. Okay, just briefly at the end, sexual selection. It involves mate choice and therefore is non-random, because natural selection implies random mating. Okay, but in nature, many times it's not random mating, especially for the eukaryotes. It's not random mating. There is selection going on, and the typical mechanisms, there are two mechanisms. The males compete with each other or against each other for the female, and the female chooses the male on some particular characteristic, some particular phenotype, right? And this is what produces, for example, dimorphism. Dimorphism is the two different sizes between the male and the female of the same species. Sometimes it's the male that is larger, as in the gorillas. This is the female gorilla, this is the male gorilla, all right? So the female is selecting the larger male. At the same time, the males are getting larger and larger because they're competing against each other, and on average, the larger male is the one that's going to win out, the alpha male. All right, so there's a double selection process going on in here. The competition between males, and the female apparently selects on the larger male, all right, has a preference for the larger male. That tells the female that this male is more fit somehow. All right, Sometimes it's the opposite. It's the male that is smaller and the female that is larger. That happens, for example, in amphibians and fish and other organisms. Well, sometimes there's no dimorphism. They just look alike. The male and the female, they look alike, and they're a pair, but they look very much alike. And you can only tell them with a genetic test or something like that. Sometimes the dimorphism is dramatic, like in the case of gorillas. Sometimes it's moderate, like in the case of humans. On average, women of the same age are shorter, a few inches shorter than men for the same age, right? We have to balance, we have to correct for age, because obviously we grow as we get taller as we grow. So I think the average is about 2 or 3 inches, something like that. But that's called a slight dimorphism, or moderate. Sometimes it gets very sophisticated at all the different, because all the different levels are interacting at the same time, all right? The behavior, here are 2 male elk competing for 2 mules, okay? It's anyone's guess which is gonna win, but eventually, on average, the beta male will walk away before getting drastically injured by the horns, okay? A lot of it is display, and a lot of it is show off. Like in the case of, these are beta splendens, these are the Siamese fighting fish. You can see there's a great variety, all the same species, all males, all adults, all right? But great variety of color, pattern, and also the tail and the fins. The fins have a slightly different pattern. Okay? That's all show, either for aggression against other males or for attraction of a female, which is very small and much smaller and doesn't look anything like this, or doesn't have the fancy tails. Except for the human. Because human, we select on each other. Okay, so there's mutual selection going on in the human, and therefore it gets very, very complicated. This is an example. I have my platform shoes and my bell-bottom pants, and I'm ready to select and be selected. Right? So, no. But I have to admit that I was like that a few decades ago. Staying alive. Staying alive. Okay. Finally. So that was the disco scene a few decades ago. Okay, finally, there's such a thing as a runaway selection. This is a drastic example. Sometimes the females get fixated on a particular phenotype, all right? And it doesn't have anything to do directly with with the sexual potency, all right? But the female is fixated on, for example, the peahen is fixated on the tail of the peacock, of the male peacock, all right? And probably the iridescent blue of the neck also. Because we see that on average, it is the more fancy peacock that gets the attention of the peahen. And the peahen has its pattern, but it's not that luxurious at all. Certainly not complicated as the peacock. And this, you understand that the tail of the peacock is an advantage to the survival of this individual, right? Imagine this guy trying to fly, for example, trying to fly away from a big cat or something. It's going to have a lot of difficulty, has to put a lot of energy. They can fly, but it is laborious to fly with this huge tail. So it is a disadvantage to the survival of this individual, yet they survive indeed because the peahen is fixated, for whatever reason, on the tail. This demonstrates fitness to the female, all right? And it happens in a number of species. For example, it happens also between coleopters, between beetles. This is the rhinoceros beetle, okay? This is the male and the female. The female as a whole is larger, but the male has this humongous set of horns here, which are actually cumbersome to get around, all right? But yet the female seems to be fixated on these huge antlers on the male, which are total display. They have no known function for the fitness or the survival of the individual male. In fact, they could be a hindrance to getting around. And they can be quite large also. So.
Could that eventually lead to extinction though? If it becomes so cumbersome that they can't get away? Yes,
at some point, runaway selection can lead to extinction, indeed. All right, and in fact, but really, all species are heading for extinction. It's this dynamic state. We're only here just for a time. You know, every species is only here for a time. And that was another of Meyer's point. 99.999% of the species that have ever existed, even from the fossil record, are no longer around. Okay, so really, all the species are leading to it's this dynamic flow and interaction between species, and that's why the community is so important. That's why the ecosystem is so important, because that's the interaction between all the species at the population level. Okay? But yes, runaway selection can lead eventually to extinction, and especially if there is drift occurring on it, and if this, for some drastic reason, let's say that this, you know, the peacocks are now in urban areas, and there's a new development that comes into this area, and there's some walls that are put up, and so this subpopulation stays in one area and can no longer bypass this concrete wall that was built for a new population or for a highway, for example. All right, and so that population could be selected out because of the runaway effect of the tail. Okay. Well, that's it. Again, thank you very much. And we'll be meeting again, not next week, because, okay. Let me stop. Any questions or comments before I close the session? No? People are good? Okay, let me close here.